Well, hello and welcome back, men of Prince George, and I also like to welcome the ladies from the Ladies Bible Study. Last week we finished their Atonement book, and they requested that they join the men for these Bible studies. So now this is just adult Bible study, men and women. So I'm very delighted to have them join us because we might have some new folks joining us for this study. This will be a bit of a longer lesson. I'm going to do a recap of where we've been, just so we can kind of orient ourselves as we get into 2 Kings chapter 6. So for those of you who are just joining us, toward the end of February in the men's Bible study, we finished the book of 1 Kings and started 2 Kings, and now we're in chapter 6. So a bit of a brief recap of where we've been in these books. Remember, originally 1 and 2 Kings were actually one book in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's just one book, and it continues the story of the Davidic kingdom and what became of it. It begins with the transition from David as king to his son Solomon as king, but the end of Solomon's reign sees the kingdom split in two, and a transition from what's called the united monarchy period to the divided monarchy period. So at the end of Solomon's reign, the kingdom splits in two. You have 10 tribes in the northern part of Israel called Israel, and you have 2 tribes in the southern part of the nation, and they are called Judah. So 1 Kings chapter 12 marks the transition from, again, united monarchy to divided monarchy when the kingdom splits in two. And from there, the rest of the story of 1 and 2 Kings is about these two nations and their interactions with each other and with some foreign nations, and especially with Yahweh and his prophets. This book introduces the role of the prophets of Yahweh, and they become very important in the storyline as people that call Israel and Judah in the north and the south back to faithfulness, but ultimately Israel does not return to faithfulness. The biblical narrative in 1 and 2 Kings, it often bounces back and forth between northern kingdom and southern kingdom, back and forth between kings, with some breaks in there for some stories about some prophets or some miracles or something like that. When the story transitions to a new king, as it often does, the Bible often provides a small summary judgment on that king. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, or he did good or right in the sight of the Lord. Most of the kings in both kingdoms, both north and south, are, quote, evil in the sight of the Lord. A few are good, a few in Judah only. And so the story kind of takes a downward spiral ever since the kingdom splits in 1 Kings 12. The nation, the two nations at this point, spiral downwards pretty much until Israel and Judah are both defeated militarily. Israel by the nation of Assyria in 721 or 722 BC, and Judah defeated by the Babylonian Empire in 586 BC, and they are both sent into exile in those respective countries. And so these books explain why the exile happened. This is Israelites looking back on the history and asking themselves the question, why are we exiled? Why did this come upon us? And explains that this exile is a judgment from God because mostly of the people's idolatry and refusal to worship him as he requires. So it's their sin. God is judging their sin. And here's where we see the prophets in the exile start to offer some hope that if Israel repents and returns to the Lord, he will bring them back. That's where the exilic prophets start to bring a message of hope in the midst of this judgment that they are undergoing. If you would like to see a much more detailed overview of these books, a great overview, hopefully there will be a link below this video that you can just click on, and that'll link you to the Bible Project. We've used them before, they're excellent. The Bible Project video where they do an overview of 1 and 2 Kings, an excellent resource. So we're currently in 2 Kings chapter 6, about in the middle of the one big book of Kings. And we just recently made the transition from Elijah as the man, the prophet of God, to Elisha, his protege, who is now the man, the prophet of God. We're in the midst of an extended focus on Elisha's miracle stories, some of the miracles that he performs and his interactions with kings and leaders and countries. And so 2 Kings chapter 6 continues that theme of miracle stories surrounding Elisha. And here we get three different stories, actually 2 distinct stories, and then the beginning of one that's going to bleed into chapter 7 when we get there. So let's dive in. 2 Kings chapter 6. And the first bit of the story, verses 1 to 7, is kind of a random miracle. It doesn't really tell us much about why it's here, but it's kind of a cool little story. So verse 1, "Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, 'See, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there.' And he answered, 'Go.' Then one of them said, 'Be pleased to go with your servants.' And he answered, 'I will go.' So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, 'Alas, my master, it was borrowed.' Then the man of God said, 'Where did it fall?' When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, 'Take it up.' So he reached out his hand and took it." So remember, the sons of the prophets are a group of prophets that are kind of around Elisha, around him, supporting him, learning under him. This is just a group of Yahweh's prophets. Remember, at this time, there's false worship all over the place, false prophets, false gods, false idols everywhere. And so you have different factions of different religions have their prophets in these different locations. And this is the group of the prophets of Yahweh that Elisha leads. Notice in verse 1 it says, "The place where we dwell under your charge." This kind of gives us a little insight into what life might have looked like. So Paul House, in his commentary, he says this building project, coupled with earlier text, indicates that the company of prophets, these sons of the prophets that we meet over and over again, lived together, ate together, and worked together, yet maintained a separate family life. We've seen, actually, in previous stories, Elisha come to the aid of not the sons of the prophets, but a widow of the sons of the prophets, his family, after he died. And so it seems like they live this kind of communal life together as the prophets, and yet have their own families in kind of a distinct living mode and area, which is interesting. In verse 5, his axe head falls into the water. This was likely made of iron, and they had to rely on the Philistines for iron about 200 years ago or so. But at this point in the narrative, it's been about 200 years since they had to rely on the Philistines for iron. But iron tools were still very expensive. And so when he loses this axe, he obviously had borrowed it from somebody else, which means that he would have to pay a substantial sum of money, which would have meant, because he's a prophet, he's not paid super well, it would have meant that he would likely have to go into slavery to pay off this debt. And so that's why he cries out, "Alas, it was borrowed." In a sense, he's asking Elisha, please help me if you can. Save me from this debt that I'm going to have to pay. Save me from slavery, in a sense. So this story is yet again confirmation that we've seen a couple times now, that Elisha is the current man of God. He's the man on earth who represents Yahweh, and he's the prophet that God has personally endorsed. That's part of the point of these miracle stories, is to basically show whose side, who has Yahweh's backing, who is his approved person, and it is Elisha and the prophets under him. It also continues a theme that we've seen throughout 1st and 2nd Kings of Yahweh providing for the people that follow him, both prophets and regular folks, non-prophets. A prophet in the Lord's service did not have the means to repay such an expensive loss as an iron axe head. And so by causing it to float, Elisha saves the man from debt and potentially servitude. As in the miracles of oil and the purifying of the stew and the multiplication of the bread, Elisha provides for the people under his care. And notice this theme. The Lord provides for his people, through his prophets. And that is a theme throughout 1st and 2nd Kings. And so then we transition. So this is kind of taking a break. These 7 verses take a break from a larger narrative about the interactions between Elisha and Israel and Syria. And now we get back in verse 8 to the stories about interactions with the king of Syria. So it's a brief detour, and then we're back on track with interacting with Syria. So verse 8. Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, "At such and such a place shall be my camp." But the man of God, that is Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel, "Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there." And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once, or twice. So without an explanation, Israel and Syria are at war yet again. They've been common enemies. And in war, we know that having intelligence, knowing the locations and the movements of your enemy is key to victory. Elisha apparently has a practice of warning Israel's king about where the king of Syria was making camp, and thus he saved Israel's king from being captured or killed multiple times, numerous occasions. So unsurprisingly, this upsets the Syrian king. So verse 11, the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. And he said, go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him. It was told him, behold, he is in Dothan. So he sent there horses and chariots and a great army. And they came by night and surrounded the city. The king of Syria is convinced, and in a lot of ways it's an understandable thought, that there's a spy in his camp who has been reporting to the king of Israel, feeding them intelligence. But his servant tells him that it's actually Elisha the prophet who's responsible. And Elisha even knows, quote, the words that the king of Syria speaks in his bedroom, knowledge that he would have no right to know on natural terms. And so though it's not explicit, the implication is clear that God is revealing these things to Elisha for the benefit of Israel, his people. Again, we see this time and time again. Even though Israel is in apostasy, even though they're rebelling against God when it comes to worship, even though they're not following God nearly with their whole heart, he continues to take care of them. He continues to provide for them. He continues to keep them safe. I would guess as a mechanism that he would use to bring them back into faithfulness. So the king of Syria spies out Elisha's location and sends an entire army to capture him. So verse 15, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was around the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, that is, he's addressing Elisha, what shall we do? He said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. So it seems like Elisha has taken on a protege of some kind, just like Elijah had done for him. He has a servant who lives with him and serves him. And he says, don't be afraid, there are more with us than there are against us. Elisha is either crazy, or he's lying, or he knows something that nobody else knows. The last of these, obviously, is the correct option. Elisha knows something that no one else knows. And notice kind of the play on, in this story, the play on sight and blindness. So verse 17, Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes, the servant's eyes, that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So the angelic armies have been there all along. Right? He's not crazy, he's not lying, but Elisha, because he has faith, because he has a connection with Yahweh that is unique and special and transcends a normal relationship with Yahweh, it might seem, because he's the prophet, the man, he can see the angelic armies even though no one else can. You might call these the eyes of faith, right? Spiritual sight. The Bible has this theme running all throughout it in multiple places. You can be physically see just fine. I mean, not impaired whatsoever, but you can be spiritually blind, and we'll get to that in a moment. So the angelic armies have been there all along, but they are invisible to the servant's eyes until the Lord enables him to see them. Again, this story is playing on the concept of blindness and sight. The servant's not blind physically, right? He can see just fine, but he cannot see spiritually, the reality that Elisha can. Elisha's close connection to the Lord is what enables him to see reality in the way that it actually is, in a deeper way, you might say. This reminded me of Matthew 23, in which Jesus is kind of proclaiming woes on the Pharisees and the scribes, and he calls them, in the space of 3 little paragraphs, he calls them blind 5 separate times. And so there's this whole notion of, in Scripture, you can see perfectly well physically and still be blind spiritually. And it takes faith, it takes a connection with the Lord in order to see reality as it really is. And so these horses and chariots of fire. So remember that fire is often associated with the divine presence in the Old Testament. Chariots and horses of fire appeared when Elijah, I'm going to get those mixed up all the time. Elijah was taken up to heaven. And so verse 18. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. Again, continuing this theme of sight and blindedness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. So verse 18 continues this theme in the narrative, this play on sight and blindness. God blinds the Syrians so Elisha can lure them willingly into a trap. A helpful note on this from the ESV Study Bible, probably not, this blindness, is probably not a loss of physical sight, so the Syrians would not doubt their location just because they could no longer physically see it. But rather this is probably a dazed mental condition in which they are open to suggestion and manipulation, but still able to follow physically the prophet to Samaria. The Syrians are maybe bedazzled, do not see things clearly, whereas Elisha's servant has been given perfect clarity of sight about reality. And so it's, again, this is more of a play on spiritual sight and blindness rather than physical, because God confuses them, right? They can't see reality for what it is. And he uses that to lure them into a trap. So verse 20. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. So the Lord opened their eyes and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria, which is the capital of the northern province of Israel. As soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, my father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down? He answered, you shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. So he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. So Elisha leads the Syrians straight into the capital of Israel, their enemy, where he opens their eyes and they see their fate. They are surrounded, and surely, if there's going to be a battle, they would surely be defeated. The king of Israel shows some deference to Elisha, calling him father, asking him what they should do, asking them if they should strike now while the iron's hot, while they have victory surely in hand. Elisha answers them that he should not kill them, he should not defeat them quickly or swiftly, treat them more as prisoners of war, because that's basically what they are at this point. He should feed them and send them on their way. This is a counterintuitive approach, perhaps, to military action, but it's in congruence, it is in continuity with the laws of Israel, especially in Exodus 23, the laws of loving your enemy, of doing good towards your enemy. So the king of Israel goes a bit further, goes a little overboard, and throws them a party, throws them a feast. There's no indication in the text whether this was approved by Elisha or not. But the Syrians return home, and then for a time, they leave Israel alone. But that lasts just as long as the next sentence. We're not sure how much time elapses between these two stories. Actually, we're not sure when this story that we just read through happens, whether this is a chronological account or an account that is kind of stitched together. Sometimes the Bible does either, stitches it together, or does it chronologically. But in any case, Israel and Syria are back at war in verse 24. So in verse 24, afterward Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. So notice the difference. There was a bit of a respite, some peace between Israel and Syria, but they go from a little raiding party across the border every once in a while to a full-on invasion of Samaria. The relief that Israel got from the raids of the Syrians in the verse 23 right above was only temporary. Here Syria engages in another level of warfare and besieges Israel's capital. And we have research and documents to show that when sieges happen in ancient warfare, things can dramatically become very bad. And that's exactly what happens. So in verse 25, and there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cob of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Things have gotten bad quickly, as they often do in ancient warfare. A donkey's head was not only undesirable, right? Who would want to eat a donkey's head? But it was also forbidden by the dietary laws. So technically, Israel should not be eating this at all. By comparison, a live horse, a whole horse, back in 1 Kings chapter 10, at the time of Solomon, sold for 150 shekels. So the head of a donkey, that's unclean animal that you can't eat, is selling for 80, whereas years ago, a whole horse would only cost you 150. So this is just, this is part of what happens when you're besieged in ancient warfare. Your whole city is surrounded by an army. You can't get supplies in or out. And so the price of everything dramatically skyrockets, and it has there. But it doesn't get any better, it gets worse. So verse 26, now as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he said, "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" So if the Lord does not help you, the king recognizes his helplessness, but there's no indication that he sought the Lord for deliverance. He needed to repent. That was the course of action he should have taken if he wanted help and he wanted to be able to help his people. He needed to reject idolatrous worship and their locations, their centers, their idols, but he was not willing to pay that price. The price apparently was too high for the king to pay. And here's where we get a picture of how bad it got. Verse 28, and the king asked her, "What is your trouble?" I mean, he knows he can't help, but he might as well hear her out. She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give me your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And on the next day I said to her, 'Give me your son, that we may eat him.' But she has hidden her son." When the king heard the words of the woman, he had sackcloth, and he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth on beneath his body. And he said, "My God, do so to me and more also, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today." So verse 28, the problem that this woman has that she wants help with is that she was tricked by a woman into giving up her son to be eaten, and the other son from the other woman was protected, was hidden. This is obviously a sickening practice, a horrifying practice, but we do have accounts of this happening in ancient warfare, in ancient times when cities were besieged. Things got this bad. And interestingly, in some note of interest, this is precisely something that the Lord had predicted in Deuteronomy 28. That is, I mean, if you fall into idolatry, if you don't follow me, then things will get this bad. He actually mentions the eating of children, not as something he wants or he commands, but as a consequence of their idolatry and their sin. And so we've reached that point. We've reached a low point in the history of Israel. You can tell, right? You can that idea of this is why the exile happened. You can tell why the exile was necessary, right? To shock Israel out of their complacency towards sin. So remember, this story contrasts very sharply, very heavily, with another story at the beginning of this book in Kings, of a king who is able to wisely discern a quarrel between two women over a baby, right? So think Solomon and the two women fighting over the one baby. There's a clear parallel here and a contrast between that old king who was wise and followed Yahweh, at least in the beginning, that was Solomon, and this king who is obviously not wise, not following Yahweh, and unable to do anything about it. So the NIV's Honored and Study Bible notes, years of covenant unfaithfulness led the nation into this tragic situation. This is one of those things that we see throughout Scripture, an emphasis of sin, in a sense, compounds. The more you sin, the easier it is to sin, and the more it happens, and the more the effects compound on each other. So in verses 30 to 31, the king responds to this scenario, right? He realizes how bad things are getting, and he tears his clothes, and he has sackcloth on underneath. Both tearing clothes and sackcloth, wearing sackcloth, are common Old Testament signs of distress, of repentance, of helplessness, but they're signs for him of desperation and not repentance. right? Because he blames. Notice who he blames. He does this just like Ahab had earlier. He blames the very person who was the solution to this. He blames Elisha. I know what I need to do. I need to go find the prophet of Yahweh and I need to kill him. Evil kings often respond this way. He thinks the prophet, he thinks Elisha and Yahweh in a twist of irony, a twist of the exact opposite of reality, as we often see in these stories. He thinks that Yahweh and Elisha are the source of the problem rather than the solution, again, showing just how corrupt the nation and the king are. And so then he sends out an army to find Elisha. So verse 32. Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king had dispatched a man from his presence. But before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door, and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" Notice again, Elisha has supernatural insight into what's going on. Before the messenger even arrives, Elisha knows that he's coming, and so he takes preemptive action against him. Verse 33, and while he was still speaking with them, the messenger came down to him and said, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" An interesting way to end this chapter, this story. This trouble is from the Lord. That's the messenger saying that to Elisha, right? So the messenger's on the king's side, and he's basically saying, look what the Lord has done to us. Why should I trust him? Why should I follow him? So the CSB Study Bible is helpful here. It says, the strongest demonstration of the king's misdirected moral sensitivity came when the messenger asked, why should he any longer trust a God who has brought such disasters on his people? This recalls the scene when Ahab, the great destroyer of Israel, accused Elijah of being the destroyer, right? We saw that in 1 Kings 18, where there's this moment of this peak of irony in the story where Ahab calls Elisha the very thing that he is, right? The destroyer. Elisha, Yahweh, they're not the destroyers of Israel. Israel, the kings, those are the destroyers through their sin and through their rebellion. The moral rebel, and this is a helpful note, the moral rebel often only sees what will justify his excuses. Furthermore, in blaming God the king, who should have represented the people to God, instead becomes a blasphemer against God. And again, there's this theme of spiritual blindness, right? The king can't see reality for what it is, that it's actually the sin of the people that's causing all of this. The messenger can't see that Yahweh is a providential, caring God who's taking care of his people when they're faithful to him and judging them when they're not, and he can't see that. He thinks that Elisha and Yahweh are to blame when they're clearly not. Sin has a way of twisting, corrupting our perception. That is our ability to see reality for what it is, for God for who he is, what he's doing for what it is. And so we come to the end of 2 Kings chapter 6. A couple of reflection questions for you as we close. Have you ever had a truth or a reality that you were blind to, or that you didn't understand or see fully, that God in some way, maybe suddenly or maybe gradually, helped you see? What do you think are some of our spiritual blind spots, both culturally, and personally? So I think about maybe something, a truth, a reality that you were blind to, that God suddenly revealed to you, or maybe over time revealed to you. Maybe you came to a greater understanding of sin or the gospel, or God's calling on your life, something like that. And then what do you think are some of the spiritual blind spots that we suffer from today in our day and age? And then finally, what can we do to relieve, to help some of those blind spots and to see better, to understand better what God is calling us to do? And then finally, just a couple lessons that I picked up from this chapter. First is the Lord, going back to the very first story, the Lord yet again provides for his people, faithfully provides for his people, his prophets, those that are following him. And then second is this, playing on that whole concept of sight and blindness, spiritually speaking. God is always present and at work. And sometimes the only thing that we need to do is to pray for God to show us, to help us see where he is at work. He's always present. He's always at work, right? Think of that army that was blind, invisible to everyone but Elisha. If we can open the eyes of our heart and see with spiritual eyes, and be aware of where God's at work, we can join him in it, and he'll bless us in that, I believe. So thanks, men and women and ladies, for joining us for this adult Bible study, and I'll see you next week for 2 Kings chapter 7. Looking forward to it. Thanks. God bless.